Good morning, everyone. My head is still filled with that incredible piece that Carol Rhodes played from Philip Glass. I deliberately closed my eyes as she was playing it because I was trying to imagine a Zen garden with lines in the sand and trying to empty my mind as much as I could from all of the day's concerns and woes, especially in light of the joys and concerns that we just heard. Mostly concerns and great sorrows. Good morning to you all. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. I was delighted to see many of you here last week, and thinking about how we are now conducting our services makes me very appreciative of a great gift that we all have, namely the gift of reason. Surely we are using reason in adhering to our current meeting procedures. Now, you may wonder why I just used the word reason twice. Well, the official theme this month for us is reason. And when I heard about the theme and agreed to talk about it, the first thing I thought about was an amazing age, the age of reason. What I want to talk about today is Thomas Paine's pamphlet, which has the same name, The Age of Reason. After a brief introduction to the historical period, which we call the Age of Reason, I will tell you the story of how Thomas Paine's pamphlet came to be written. It's an amazing story. I will then show you how Thomas Paine argues against the traditional religion of his time and how he argues in favor of his own view, which he calls Deism. But there's always a but if we're used. Thomas Paine's critical methods, it turns out, can also be used against his own views. So after presenting some important problems from Paine's work, I'm then going to try to address what important insights we should take away from his approach to religion and how we might apply these important insights to our current lives. Let's begin with talking about the Age of Reason. Like it or not, we are all living in the aftermath of the Age of Reason. What is that? Well, some of us call it the Enlightenment. The great Age of Reason is defined as the period of rigorous scientific, political, and philosophical discourse that characterized European society during that long century that began in the late 17th century and ended at the ending of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So roughly, say, 1680 to 1815. You can think in terms of Isaac Newton and John Locke at the beginning, and Kant and Priestley as being figures at the end. Now, when you and I think about the Enlightenment, probably the first figure that comes to our minds is that of the great biting French critic Voltaire and his wonderful book Candide. Now, I should tell you that Paine has been called the English Voltaire, but of course, being English, he's not as funny, but he's every bit as critical and biting. This period, the Age of Reason, coincides with the rise of modern science, the development of serious biblical criticism, and the emergence of deism as an alternative to scripture-based religion. All three of these items are highlighted for us in Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason. Now, you might say, well, why is the Age of Reason significant for us UUs? Well, I think you just got an inkling in the story that Anne read. The Age of Reason is where we American and English UUs came from. And I think Paine helps us see how. Heather is now going to show us quickly show us a political cartoon that I happened to find online when I was trying to look up some stuff about Priestley and Paine. And it turns out that the very famous British political cartoonist Cruikshank wrote this cartoon, which he takes to be a criticism of both Priestley and Paine, who knew each other and collaborated. And what you'll see if you read the materials on the right, you'll see that Thomas Paine is associated with gunpowder and rebellion and doing all kinds of horrible things. Gunpowder, gunpowder, gunpowder. And you've got, you see Joseph Priestley on the left being associated with plots and what else? Brutus and Catiline, the great conspirators. And so the idea is that these two people who believe strongly in Republican ideals are somehow seeking to undermine the traditional values in society. You'll see under the table, they've got treason and murderers and axes and all kinds of things going on. I think it's a remarkable cartoon. You can also see the guillotine over on the side there, on the right. This is all stuff about the horrible things that are happening in the French Revolution. And so this gives us, I think, a nice introduction to some of the things I'm going to be talking about. Heather's going to remove that cartoon, otherwise you're going to be staring at that instead of me for the next 20 minutes. Wait a minute. We're talking about the age of reason. Before I start talking about Paine, shouldn't I say something about reason? What's reason? Well, it's clearly a mental faculty. Plato thought it was one of the three that we have, along with the appetites and the senses. But typically when we think of reason, we think of a set of powerful intellectual abilities. We think of thinking clearly, right? But specifically, when we talk about reason, we're talking about two kinds of complementary processes. One we'll call deduction, where we try to figure out what claims follow from other claims and what claims are either consistent or inconsistent with other claims. And we also think about induction, where we try to figure out what general claims are true based upon the evidence we have. And then we also try to figure out what kind of reasoning we can involve ourselves with using these claims, what kind of probabilities we can assign to various claims, and so forth. So induction and deduction are basically what we have in mind when we talk about reason. Okay, enough of that kind of professor stuff. I'm retired. I have to go on to a story. The story we have to tell is the story of Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. It's a story I didn't know anything about. And so I was just blown away this past month when I've been reading Paine and trying to make sense out of him and try to put him in context and figure out what value he has for us. He was born in 1737. That's 5 years after George Washington was born. And he died in 1809, which is a famous date that all of you should know. Ask yourselves, why should you know it? Well, it's the the year that Abraham Lincoln was born. All right. So he's in between two of our most famous presidents. He was the political activist, I think, of his age. Well, Samuel Adams was pretty close, but Paine actually, I think, had a lot more influence than Samuel Adams did, because Paine was a pamphleteer, right? These days, he would have had the hottest blog on the internet, but they didn't have blogs back then. But they had pamphlets, and people wrote pamphlets, and the pamphlets were very impressive. Paine's most powerful pamphlet was something that we all know, that we learned in American history, called Common Sense, and it sold 500,000 copies when it was printed. And it's basically an attack on how the British Crown was treating the American colonies, and it roused up a lot of people and probably was one of the major causes of the American Revolution. At least that's what many historians will tell us. But that's not the only thing that's interesting and important about Thomas Paine for us. Thomas Paine wrote a second work, and this work he wrote was called On Human Rights. And that work was a reply to Edmund Burke, who was the great conservative writer in England at the time of the French Revolution. And Edmund Burke wrote a powerful piece about the French Revolution, and he criticized it, and he talked about how it was going to destroy morality and so forth. And Paine was very upset because he said, no, the French system was horrible, and he laid out in great detail how it was horrible and how human rights need to be respected. For his troubles, his work was censured in England, and he was forced to flee. He fled to France, where, interestingly, he was invited to be one of two foreigners to take part in the assembly, which was then at that point leading the French Revolution and trying to come up with laws and trying to figure out what to do with the horrible aristocratic class and trying to pass all kinds of interesting legislation and so forth. Now, Paine, it turns out, couldn't speak French. So he wrote his long talks in English, and they had to be read, and he couldn't reply. But at least he made this incredible effort because he viewed being part of the assembly as being a most important thing for him to be doing. His work was he no longer needed to be involved in the United States. The United States had taken over; it was doing a great job, at least he thought, and comparatively. And so he needed to go to be helpful in France. But guess what? He wasn't radical enough for the assembly. He made the mistake of uttering the famous phrase, "Kill the monarchy, not the man," by which he meant get rid of the monarchy, but don't kill the king and all the people who are associated with it. Just take their power and their positions away and set up a new government. The second thing that got him in trouble is that he wasn't atheistic enough for the people who are leading the revolution. And so, his theism actually got him into trouble. His deism. And he ran afoul of a particular nasty character called Robespierre, who started killing everybody in sight, and was sentenced and sent to the Conciergerie, which is a huge medieval castle in the middle of Paris on an island right next to Notre Dame, that was used as a prison, and he was sentenced to be guillotined. Okay, now, why am I telling you all of this? It turns out that he remembered that his good friend, John Adams, remember that name? Our second president? John Adams, who was also a Unitarian, at one point had said to him, "Tom, you really should write down your religious views." So, not having much else to do, being stuck in the prison and awaiting being guillotined, Paine thought, well, I'll write down a religious tract. I mean, what do you want to do something like that? I find it just amazing that that's what he used his time to do. So he wrote down, in 1793, he started writing the first part of his Age of Reason. And it's about 90 pages long, and he presents his views and his arguments with some specific examples of very powerful biblical criticism, arguing that a literal translation of the scriptures, both old and new, is total nonsense. He sends it off to a publisher. It gets published. There's a fierce reaction to it. Luckily, Robespierre at this point has alienated so many people that he himself gets guillotined, and the age of the reign of terror comes to an end, and Paine is released from prison. But in the meantime, he stirred up so much controversy with this first part of the Age of Reason that he thinks to himself that he has to reply to it. So he takes another 2 years, and in 1795, he comes out with the second part of his Age of Reason, equally long, but this time, instead of giving his arguments and his views, he's mostly going after every single book of the Old Testament and the New Testament and revealing every inconsistency and contradiction he can possibly find, as well as making one moral argument after another against how horrible these works really are, that they really couldn't have been holy works inspired by a good creator at all. And so this is basically what happens in 1795. He comes up with this work. As a result of this particular work, Paine goes down when he dies in 1809 later as being known as the greatest atheist of his age, which is a total error. He wasn't an atheist. He was a deist. And I'll get back to that in a minute. He dies in New York City. He's buried in New Rochelle in the farm that the state of New York gave him for all of his work during helping generals and writing pamphlets during the Revolutionary War. There is some, if you go online, you'll discover there's a controversy as to whether his bones are still there or whether somebody unburied them and took them back to England. There's a lot of interesting stuff about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, it turns out, has a number of UU congregations named after him. He's a very powerful and popular figure. Now, having said something about the story to try to interest you in Thomas Paine as a person, I need to say something about how he combines reason and religion and how we can make sense out of his views. As you've already heard, he rejects the scriptures. The reason he does this is he thinks that revelation is nonsense. He says revelation only works if you've had your own personal revelation. If somebody tells you they've had a revelation, you have no way of knowing whether what was revealed to them was true or not. You have to wait until you have the same revelation yourself. As a result of rejecting revelation, he is then led to reject also all talk of miracles, mystery, and prophecy. As I've mentioned, he's horrified by both the Old Testament, which he thinks is basically a glorification of genocide. And frankly, I remember as a child reading the Old Testament and thinking, I sure wouldn't have wanted to be a Philistine because they seem to be getting it, constantly. Or a glorification of child abuse and filicide. I mean, that again was my first reaction when I read about what's happening in the New Testament. Really? A father killing his son? That's sort of like Abraham trying to kill Isaac, except that in the New Testament, it succeeds. I mean, it seems pretty awful. So as a result, I think the most powerful negative argument that Paine comes up with, I'll call the moral insult argument, is the idea that it's insulting to think that a supreme good being would used genocide or filicide as a way of trying to further any kind of religious agenda at all. So what's Paine's positive view? Well, Anne read to you a quote that I asked her to read from Paine, where pretty clearly Paine tells us we didn't cause ourselves, so there had to be some first cause. And that first cause had to be spiritual. And so he argues that by using deduction, you can come up with the idea that there has to be a first cause. And then by using induction, according to Paine, what we do is we look around the world and we see evidence of the marvelous workings of all the creatures around us, the complicated interactions in our environment between plants and animals, and how wonderfully everything is set up. And of course, what's important, I think most wonderful about Paine is he says the greatest gift that God gave us, God being the first cause here, is the gift of reason, by which we can come to know God, and equally importantly, we can come to do science. Now, what is science for Thomas Paine? Science is figuring out the laws of the universe, and the laws of the universe are basically God's laws. So that's how he combines religion and science. Science is basically figuring out God's laws for governing the first causes laws, God's laws for governing the universe. I think it's a pretty neat view. He of course claims that only deism is supported by reason. He rejects revealed religion, and he thinks that atheism doesn't make any sense based upon what he takes to be the obvious evidence of God from the natural world around him. Now, we should note that Paine doesn't bother with or doesn't consider a standard Unitarian Universalist stalwart alternative, namely agnosticism, which is the view that we really don't know one way or the other, whether there's a a spiritual first cause or whether there's nothing, we should remember that agnosticism as a term, as a concept, really wasn't clearly defined until some 70 years later by Thomas Huxley at a meeting of the Metaphysical Society in London, in case you want to look that up. Now, let's see if we can make some sense out of Thomas Paine's deism. Clearly, he got it from his Quaker upbringing. The Quakers apparently didn't put a lot of credence in Scripture. He also got it from his great respect for science. I won't tell you other fascinating aspects of the tremendously inventive scientific mind that Thomas Paine had. I'll let you look those up. So his deism consists in having a God as a first cause. The evidence for it is the world around us, which must have been created by something else. In addition to being the creator, God, on Paine's account, has pretty much all of the main features that the traditional theist gives him, namely, it's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent. However, unlike the theist's God, Paine's God is not a personal God who requires placating with prayer and doesn't intervene in the world. It's very much the divine watchmaker model. Interestingly, Paine is agnostic about whether there's an afterlife. He's not sure if there is one, but he says God has the power to make one if he thinks it's important. So he leaves it up to God to decide. Now, what's interesting is if you consider the science of the time, science was still being dominated by Newton and Priestley, and both of them were deists. Paine's view provides answers to what demands explaining, namely, where did life come from and how it continues. Remember, we don't have anything like a Big Bang theory or evolution. We have no sense of any really good sense of how old the Earth is. We have no genetics. We don't have any wonderfully worked out chemistry or physics. And we've also got to explain where the moral sense came from, which is very important for Paine. Where did our morality come from? He thinks it had to come from some giver of morality, namely his first cause. So without a well worked out scientific alternative available, we might be tempted to give Paine a pass and say, yeah, it's an okay view. But I think as careful reasoning Unitarian Universalists, we need to ask, did reason even in 1795 strongly support deism, at least Paine's version of it, and does it do so today? I think the answers are not so obviously clear. So we're moving on to the third part of the talk, which is about criticisms of Paine. It has probably occurred to a number of you, as I've been talking, that Paine's critical methodology can be used against his first cause argument. Well, let me give you 4 quick criticisms. Granting a first cause doesn't mean it has to be a non-material first cause. It could be a material first cause. Granting a first cause doesn't mean that the first cause has to be a good, powerful, knowledgeable, all-present first cause. Granting a first cause doesn't decide between a single first cause or a committee of first causers, as the polytheists always claimed it was. And most importantly, granting a first cause doesn't mean that you have to believe that the first cause is still around. All right, it could have just gone out of business, taken a vacation. So there are lots of holes that you can poke in Paine's claim that reason requires we accept the first cause. But here's the thing. For me, the biggest problem that Paine doesn't consider, and it's one that was out there because it's one that's raised by Voltaire and it was raised by David Hume, whom Paine, if he hadn't read them, shame on him. He should have. They were among the major thinkers of the time. And that problem was the problem of evil. If the first cause is supposed to be a good, powerful, and knowledgeable being, why is there so much evil in the world? You couldn't have lived through the 17th and 18th centuries without having been aware of hideous amounts of evil, right? Paine was going through the reign of terror, which is a major part of evil. The beginning of the 18th century, it was the Lisbon earthquake, which killed 30,000 people. Incredible evil that nobody could explain. Paine didn't bother to do so. What about modern attacks? So these are old attacks on Paine. I think Paine should have said something about that. He didn't. Shame on him. What about modern attacks on Paine? Well, it's turned out in the past 200 some years since he's written that what were taken to be absolute truths about the nature of the universe that were revealed by pure human reason, things like every event has a cause, Newtonian mechanics, Euclidean geometry, all of these have faced serious intellectual challenges. Quantum mechanics challenges determinism. Relativity theory challenges Newtonian mechanics. And there are even non-Euclidean geometries. It turns out that not all of Euclid's postulates could be things that could be proved purely by reason alone. It also turns out, if you look at psychology, that human beings, when they reason, turn out to be much less accurate than they think they are. In fact, it turns out that our split-second judgments are often much more accurate than the ones that we take a lot of time with, right? And so we tend to have a really overrated view of our own abilities. Further, here's a third criticism. Many of the claims that were taken to be revealed by reason have turned out to be sheer prejudice. Think about the views that were common in 1795. Misogyny, racism, white supremacy of all sorts. All of these were thought to have been revealed by reason. Not so. We know that to be true now. And fourthly, it's clear that evolution is a powerful alternative way of explaining where humans came from, indicates that our wonderful brains have evolved from less wonderful brains, right? So we have a way of explaining where reason might have come from and where our morality might have come from without having to rely on something like a first cause. But does this mean that we should abandon reason? Or no, I think it means we should use it much better. Let's first think about, we're moving into the last part of the talk, we need to first think about what Paine got right. As you used, we need to acknowledge that revelation to one person is not binding to others. I think Paine is just right about that. Religious truth is not sealed. There are many more things to be discovered. Prophecy, mystery, and miracles are just crutches for not thinking. If somebody tells you I had a prophecy, or this is mystery, or this is a miracle, I think, well, good for you, not for me. Fourth, we should try to find arguments and evidence that are going to appeal to everybody. In a way, Paine tells us to be universalist about our religious thinking. It's got to be things that everybody can find. And fifth, reason is a wonderful gift. It is indeed a wonderful gift. And why is it such a wonderful gift? Well, it's important for us now. Why? Well, if you're not going to be a Paine deist, and you're not going to be a biblical literalist, then you've got to figure out what religious view you're going to have. And what are you going to use? Well, you're probably going to use a combination of induction and deduction to try to figure out what makes the most sense for you. Among the religious views that I find common among my Unitarian and Universalist friends are deism, spiritualism, Buddhism, some kind of natural religion, agnosticism, and atheism. I think we are blessed by having this half dozen of views constantly running up against each other and people trying to make sense and choose between them. We desperately need reason also to evaluate arguments and evidence with respect to the truly serious issues that we face: human rights issues, social justice issues, climate and sustainability issues. On the front of today's paper is an article about human behavior is the key to trying to figure out how to deal with the COVID crisis. If people use reason and they start with the premise that they want to stay alive and they want society to stay alive, it's pretty hard to see how you can argue against being vaccinated and getting yourself vaccinated and trying to encourage everybody that you know to get vaccinated. Similarly, with regard to climate issues, I presented last year about all the stuff that's going on at the United Nations, where people are gathering all kinds of information about what's happening to the planet. If we want to preserve the planet, then clearly we need to use reason to figure out ways to do that. If we want to engage in sustainable practices, we have to figure out whether the particular practices that we pick, in fact, are going to work, or they're just ones that make us feel good, or the ones that we've traditionally done. We have to be open to there being new discoveries that might make us want to change our mind. This leads us, I think, to a famous quote from David Hume that I've always fallen back on, which is that reason is and always should be the slave of the passions. Let me repeat that. Reason is and always should be the slave of the passions. Reason by itself can't determine for you what you're going to be passionate about. You will do that for yourself. Hopefully you will use some reason to do that, that you won't become passionate about things that are totally crazy. But once you've figured out what you're passionate about, you then have to use reason if you want to actually accomplish anything. So, final comment. What is the proper role for reason for us now as UUs? Reason is wonderful, but it's not enough. I think what Paine should also have emphasized was the importance of open-mindedness. Open-mindedness is a critical intellectual and religious virtue that I think we're very good at practicing, but we need to remind ourselves that we are good at practicing it and to encourage ourselves to practice it even more. This is because of the many recognized traps that we know our reasoning can fall into. We need to be humble when we claim to have reached a particular claim by reasoning. We need to run our efforts not just by our friends who we think will agree with us, but we also need to run our reasonings by those whom we suspect will disagree with us. Only then can we have some modicum of hope not to have confused our prejudices and our limited vision and experience with the truth. Thank you very much.